And at root, now this is just a kind of mood, is that it's really kind of a pragmatic point of view. All that's vital for a conceptual system is that lay down reasoning pathways able to convey us from correct input measurements to correct output numbers. And here's Feynman saying it in very crude form. The whole purpose of physics is to find a number with decimal points, etc. Otherwise, you haven't done anything. Now that's crude, but it, you know, heck, we're in the crudity here, right? Okay, but anyway, that's what Mach was trying to do. And Mach was trying to oppose various, actually quite sensible factors that he thought were inhibiting the development of mechanics. I mean, they're very reasonable at the time when he was actually active. I used to always hate Mach, but when you embed him in these scientific concepts, you become more sympathetic to what he's doing. Anyway, the spirit is, hell, we don't need to understand nature in the manner that you other guys expect. We merely need to predict its courses accurately. Okay, and I already said this. I'm particularly interested in what were the actual physical problems that were bothering Hertz, causing the Riemann principles in mathematics. And he tried to unravel these through supplying a replacement axiomatics that made no attempt to capture the prior meanings of words like force. By the way, he did not think that force was a metaphysically problematic term or anything like that. He just thought there were mathematical difficulties associated with it, and he was right about that. Okay. Anyway, so very few steps are required from Hertz's point of view to the logic-centered view of concepts favored by the positivist movements. Again, as implicit definability, and Hilbert was a sort of a great inspirational figure in this, and in fact, Hilbert did set the axiomatization of classical mechanics, meaning the problems that Hertz was worried about, as one of his 20 problems that mathematics was part of his 6th problem. And the sort of picture is that a theoretical term like force gets its meaning through its ties through the theory to measurement or observation. Okay. And this anti-classical approach to conceptual content explains why the positivists came to regard a well-articulated logical structure in the sense of Principia Mathematics as the most fundamental structuring required in this kind of theoretical framework. Okay. And in fact, the maximized conceptual liberalism suggests that the sort of logical benchmarks of axiomatic structures should represent the only substantial restrictions upon scientific conceptualization. And set theory, from this point of view, supplies most general procedures for sound concept construction in an anti-classical vein. Okay, and that's essentially the way Carnap looked at it, and why set theory, or set higher order logic, is part of Carnap's theory of adequately liberal concept formation, as I understand it. Now later in the talk, I'm going to try to give you a different picture of the role of set theory in physics. That is not this, that doesn't have this character. Okay. Anyway, there's Michael himself, and so this is, in Michael's article about me, he emphasized this history, and this is what he meant by a distinctive view of logic, and you can easily motivate or be tied to a neo-Kantian picture of how reasoning works within science. Many of the positivists made such associations. Some of them didn't, or they changed their mind about it, but there's a natural route to doing that. And in particular, if you believe, and it's very natural from this axiomatic perspective, that some range of structural provisos must be put in place before it even makes sense to talk of the empirical predictions within a framework, right? So you have to put, well, Carnap's framework principles have to be laid down to the prime and hump of empirical inference. Natural thing to think. And that gives you a notion, this is how you make a bridge to a modified form of Kantianism, is one bridge to get into a relativized a priori that Carnap and Michael has substituted for the absolute requirement, constructive requirements of Kant. But in many ways, it would still be very Kantian in spirit. Now, however, at first blush, it seems that one could plausibly still hold on to an implicit definability picture of how terms in science get their meaning, but reject any clean sort of relativized a priori on the grounds that developmental pressures in real life science are apt to muddy what qualifies as presupposition and what qualifies as empirical after effect in science. And insofar as I understand it, that point of view is exactly points. You know, very much in agreement with the general picture, except that you start off the engine of science, you may have some meaning postulates, but they get muddied up just because of the pressures, development pressures within science. Okay. Now, one of the things, and it's a very important theme in Michael's book, it's an important challenge that sometimes I've noticed talking to other philosophers of science, they don't notice that they have to meet it. They don't like Michael's neo-Kantianism, right? But in support of that is an important sort of observation about what Quine has done that they don't seem to recognize is there, and they've got to answer it somehow. That, in other words, what Michael wants to say in this important subsidiary theme, that when you throw out that notion of semantic prerequisite, you know, as you throw out the analytic-synthetic distinction, you relinquish a vital tool you need to understand the peculiar difficulties of real-life conceptual advance. And this is the sort of thing I am concerned with in the book, you know. What is the actual engines that drive conceptual development forward in science? And okay. So Michael says, let's go back to the historical resistance to geometry of the non-Euclidean stride. Okay. Well, those thought experiments that we alluded to, the famous ones about living on, you know, ants living on a globe and all that sort of thing, played an important role in bridging this gap. Okay. And what Michael wants to emphasize is those thought experiments, which are of some sort of philosophical stripe, plainly were necessary to make the classical physics to relativity transition become rationally adjudicated. Okay. Rather than merely representing the crude triumph of one doctrine over another because of politics and funding agencies and all that sort of thing. Okay. And so it's that rational adjudication. You've got to have a view of conceptual content that it can explain why those thought experiments were a necessary bridge to making that transition.